Ruth Calloway did not look up when Beatrice Ashworth's gloved hand knocked the basket of tomatoes clean off the fair table, letting them roll into the dirt in front of 40 watching neighbors. She knelt. She picked each one up, wiped it clean on her apron, and set it back exactly where it had been. "There," she said quietly, not to Beatrice, not to the crowd, just to the tomatoes, still good. By the end of that same afternoon, the richest rancher in the county would be standing in front of everyone, holding her hand, telling them all why he'd never once cared what her garden looked like from the road. If you've ever been the one folks looked past, the one whose worth got measured by the state of her hands or her hem instead of what she actually built, this story is for you. Hit subscribe before we start, because you won't want to miss where this family ends up. Drop the name of your town or county in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the end, because what Ruth says to Beatrice Ashworth in front of the whole fairground is a moment you'll want to hear in full. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Willow Bend, Kansas, the spring of 1884. Willow Bend sat where the Cottonwood Creek bent west before it met the Arkansas, a town of one bank, 2 churches, and a mercantile that sold everything from plow blades to peppermint sticks. It was not a rich town, but it liked to believe it was a respectable one, and respectability, in Willow Bend, had a great deal to do with how a woman's dress hung and how clean her fingernails stayed. Ruth Calloway's fingernails were never clean. By 6 every morning she was already on her knees in the half-acre behind her cabin, turning soil that had been her husband's pride before a wagon accident took him 2 winters back. She worked in a dress patched so many times over the elbows that the original calico pattern had nearly vanished under mismatched squares of blue and brown, and her boots had been resoled with strips of harness leather because a cobbler cost money she didn't have. She was a broad, sturdy woman, built the way farm work built a body, strong through the shoulders and forearms, heavy-set in a way that came from years of hauling water buckets and digging root cellars rather than from any softness of living. Her hands, when she wasn't wearing gloves, which was most of the time, were cracked and brown and certain in everything they touched. She had turned that half-acre into something no one else in Willow Bend had managed, a garden that produced in abundance when everyone else's crops struggled against the Kansas wind. Squash vines climbed her fence rails. Her tomatoes came in red and heavy weeks before anyone else's. She grew beans, corn, melons, and a stand of sunflowers along the property line that turned gold every August. And on Saturdays, she loaded what she couldn't eat or put up in jars onto a borrowed cart and drove it into town to sell at the market square. The women of Willow Bend did not make this easy for her. "There's the widow Calloway," Constance Pruitt murmured to her sister one Saturday morning, not troubling to lower her voice as Ruth passed with her cart, digging in the dirt like a hired girl. A woman ought to have more pride than that, even a poor one. "Bless her heart," came the reply, pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "I suppose when a woman looks like that, there's no harm in getting a little dirtier." Ruth did not turn around. She kept walking, the cart wheels grinding over the gravel, her spine straight as a fence post. She had learned, in 2 years of widowhood, that the surest way to lose an argument in this town was to appear to be having one. So she said nothing, set up her stall at the corner of Main and 3rd the way she did every Saturday, and began arranging her tomatoes in neat, defiant rows. Thomas Hargrove noticed her that same morning, though it was not the first time he had. He was 34, owned more grazing land than any 3 men in the county combined, and had a reputation in Willow Bend for being a hard worker and a harder man to draw into conversation. He'd ridden past the market that day only to collect a shipment of nails from the mercantile, but he stopped his horse at the corner when he saw a boy of no more than 10 reach up and knock 2 of Ruth's melons to the ground, laughing, then run off before she could catch him. Ruth didn't chase him. She simply bent, retrieved the melons, checked them for cracks, and set them back on the table. Thomas dismounted, walked over, and picked up one of the melons himself before she could stop him. "This one's split," he said, turning it in his hands. "I'll take it off your hands for half price if that suits you. Waste not." It was such a plain, unremarkable thing to say that Ruth looked up at him properly for the first time. He wasn't smiling in the practiced, pitying way some of the men in town smiled at her, the smile that said, "Poor thing." Underneath it, he was simply looking at the melon, and then at her, waiting for an answer like she was any merchant he did business with on any given Saturday. "Suits me fine," Ruth said. He paid her, tucked the melon under his arm, and rode off without another word. It was, by any measure, a small and forgettable transaction. Ruth thought about it for the rest of the day anyway. She thought about it while she packed up her unsold squash that evening, and again while she scrubbed the cartwheels clean of market dust, turning the moment over the way she might turn a stone in her palm to check it for cracks. It was not the melon itself that stayed with her, $50, split fruit, nothing worth remembering on its own. It was the plainness of it. Thomas Hargrove had not looked at her the way the bank clerk looked at her when she came in to make her note payment, with a careful, managed kindness that made her feel like a problem being handled. He had not looked at her the way the church women looked at her, with eyes that catalogued her patched dress and her sunburned neck before they ever reached her face. He had looked at a split melon, decided it was still worth $50, and said so. It was such an ordinary way to be treated that it took her the better part of a day to understand why it had struck her at all. He came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. By the fourth week, it had become something neither of them named out loud, but both understood. Thomas Hargrove rode into Willow Bend every Saturday morning, tied his horse at the corner post, and walked straight to Ruth Calloway's stall before he did anything else in town. He never lingered over pleasantries. He looked at what she had, really looked, picking up an ear of corn and testing the give of the kernels, turning a tomato to check its color on the shaded side, and he asked her questions no one else bothered to ask. "How do you keep the squash bugs off without arsenic?" he said one morning, crouching slightly to inspect a crate of yellow crookneck squash unmarked by a single bite. "Marigolds along the border rows, and I pick the eggs off the underside of the leaves by hand. First thing, before the sun's up good," Ruth said. "Tedious. Works, though." "Huh?" He straightened up. "I've lost half a garden bed to those things 3 years running. My mother used to say the same thing about marigolds, and I never believed her." "Your mother was right." "Generally was," Thomas said, and something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I'll take 4 of these, and whatever else looks like it wants a home." It became a rhythm. Every Saturday, the same corner, the same low, unhurried conversation about soil and rain and which end of the county had gotten hailed on. He never once mentioned her dress, or her hands, or the size of her, the way half the town seemed unable to stop themselves from doing in one form or another. He talked to her the way he might talk to another rancher about cattle prices, as an equal who happened to know things worth knowing. In the 6th week, he brought her a burlap sack of seed potatoes from a supplier out of Topeka. "Heard you mention you hadn't found a good source," he said, setting the sack down like it was nothing at all. "Man owed me a favor. Thought of you." Ruth turned one of the potatoes over in her palm. It was a small thing, a sack of seed potatoes, and yet it was also not small at all. It meant he had remembered an offhand comment she'd made 3 weeks before about her old potato seed running thin and pale. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "Didn't need to. Wanted to." He tipped his hat, the closest thing to a formal gesture he ever gave her, and walked back to his horse. She watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that Thomas Hargrove was the only person in Willow Bend who spoke to her like she had not already been sorted, judged, and filed away. The town noticed the pattern too, of course. Word moved through Willow Bend the way water moved through a ditch, quietly, persistently, finding every low place to settle. By midsummer, it was common knowledge that the richest rancher in the county rode in every Saturday to stand at the widow Calloway's vegetable stall for the better part of an hour, and common knowledge did not know quite what to do with that fact, so it did what small towns do with anything it cannot explain. It began to talk. Beatrice Ashworth was the wife of Walter Ashworth, who owned the Willow Bend Trust and Savings Bank, and she considered herself, without ever having to say so aloud, the arbiter of what passed for good taste and good sense in the county. She wore silk on Sundays, imported clear from St. Louis, kept a daughter, Delphine, whom she was determined to marry well, and she had watched Thomas Hargrove's Saturday ritual with a rising and specific irritation, because Thomas Hargrove was, by every reasonable calculation, supposed to marry Delphine. She cornered Ruth outside the Mercantile on a hot July afternoon, her parasol angled just so against the sun, two of her friends trailing a respectful half-step behind like ladies-in-waiting. "Mrs. Calloway." Beatrice's smile arrived first, warm and entirely false, the kind of smile that had been perfected over years of saying cruel things pleasantly. "I do so admire your industry. Truly. Not every woman would be willing to work a garden like a field hand, especially not at your age, and given your circumstances." Her eyes moved, briefly, deliberately, down the line of Ruth's patched dress and back up again. Bless her heart, I always say. Some women simply weren't built for the finer things, and it's a mercy when they find their place instead of reaching for what isn't meant for them. The two friends tittered softly behind their gloved hands. Ruth felt the words land the way a slap lands, sharp, precise, meant to be felt exactly where it hurt most. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She set down the sack of flour she'd been carrying, squared it against her hip so it wouldn't tip, and looked Beatrice Ashworth directly in the eye. "I expect you're right, that I wasn't built for the finer things, Mrs. Ashworth," Ruth said, evenly. "I was built for the useful ones. Good day to you." She picked the flour back up and walked on, leaving Beatrice standing on the boardwalk with her smile beginning, very slightly, to curdle at the edges. It was not the last Ruth would hear from her. Within the week, whispers reached Ruth's ears, through the mercantile clerk, through a neighbor woman who meant well by the telling, that Beatrice had been heard in her parlor remarking that it was a shame the bank still carried paper on that little Calloway plot, and that some debts, once called in, have a way of correcting a woman's circumstances rather quickly. Ruth's late husband had borrowed against their land 2 years before his death, a modest note held by the Willow Bend Trust and Savings, Walter Ashworth's bank. It had never troubled her before. She had made every payment on time, to the dollar, for 2 years running. She did not know, not yet, that Beatrice had begun asking her husband, in the particular patient way a woman asks for something she intends to get, whether that note couldn't be called due early, payable in full, all at once, a sum Ruth could never hope to raise from a half-acre of vegetables, no matter how good the season. Ruth only knew that something had shifted, the way the air shifts before a storm crosses the flatland, and that she would need to be steadier on her feet than ever. The letter came on a Tuesday in August, delivered by the bank's clerk with an apologetic set to his shoulders that told Ruth everything before she'd broken the seal. Notice is hereby given that the outstanding balance on the note secured against the property of Ruth E. Calloway is called due in full, payable no later than the 1st of October. Failure to remit the full sum will result in foreclosure proceedings and transfer of title. The sum was $91. To most men in the county, it would have been the cost of a good horse. To Ruth, working a half-acre with her own 2 hands, it was very nearly impossible, a number so far beyond what her garden could earn between now and October that reading it felt like being told to walk to Topeka by sundown. She sat at her kitchen table for a long while, with the letter flat under her palms, not crying, just breathing, the way she had taught herself to breathe through every hard thing since Daniel died. Then she folded it, put it in the tin box where she kept what little else mattered, and went out to check on the beans, because the beans did not care about banknotes and needed tending regardless. She told no one at first. Pride, she would admit to herself later, played some part in that. She did not want Willow Bend's sympathy any more than she wanted its scorn, and she suspected the two traveled together more often than not. But word of a called note does not stay quiet in a town the size of Willow Bend, and within a week, half the county seemed to know before Thomas did, which was, in its way, its own small cruelty. He found out from the bank clerk himself, over a transaction that had nothing to do with Ruth at all, and he rode straight from town to her cabin without sending word ahead, which he had never done before. She was in the garden when he arrived, kneeling between rows of late corn, and she stood when she heard his horse, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit, rather than any wish to appear presentable. "I heard about the note," he said, without preamble, the way he said most things. $91, called due whole. "I'll manage it," Ruth said, though she had, in her most honest hours, no idea how. "You could sell to the railroad men," Thomas said carefully. "I hear they're offering fair money for plots along the creek bend for a depot spur. Your half-acre sits right in the line they'd want." "This is Daniel's land," Ruth said, and for the first time since the letter arrived, something in her voice cracked, thin as a hairline fracture in glass. Not a break, but the promise of one, if pressed further. "I'm not selling what he built, so a bank that already has more money than sense can turn a profit twice over." Thomas studied her for a long moment, the wind moving the sunflower heads along the fence line behind her. "Then don't sell it," he said. "Fight for it." "With what?" "With whatever it takes," he said. "I've got money enough to buy that note outright tomorrow, if you'd let me." Ruth's chin came up. "I won't be bought away out of trouble, Mr. Hargrove. Not even by you. Not even kindly meant." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer, and respected it more for having heard it plainly. "Then we'll find another way. But you're not doing this alone. Whether you let me pay the note or not, I mean to be standing next to you when this gets settled, one way or another." In the weeks that followed, Ruth did what she had always done when the ground shifted under her. She worked. She rose earlier, stayed out later, canned every jar of beans and pickled every cucumber the half-acre would give her, selling not just at Saturday market, but driving her cart to 3 neighboring towns besides, wearing a groove into the road that hadn't been there before. She counted coins into the tin box each night by lamplight, watched the sum creep upward by dollars and half-dollars, and knew, even as she counted, that she would fall short by more than half no matter how many jars she filled. She told no one how frightened she was, not even Thomas, because fear was not a thing she let herself hand to other people. It felt too much like handing them a weapon. But she noticed, on the nights the arithmetic refused to come out right no matter how many times she added it, that she pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and simply breathed, the way she had the day the letter first arrived, until the room stopped feeling like it was closing in around her. Word reached her, secondhand, that Beatrice Ashworth had been overheard at a church social remarking that it would be such a mercy, really, for that poor woman to be relieved of a burden clearly too large for her to carry alone, as though the foreclosure Beatrice herself had engineered were an act of kindness rather than an act of spite dressed up in a Sunday bonnet. Ruth heard it and felt something harden in her chest, not quite anger, something steadier and more useful than anger, a resolve that whatever happened with the note, she would not let Beatrice Ashworth be the one to write the ending of this particular story. It was in that same stretch of weeks that Thomas began appearing at her place on evenings that had nothing to do with market day, mending a section of fence that had sagged for 2 years, hauling in a load of firewood before the first frost, never asking to be thanked, and rarely staying more than the length of the chore itself. Ruth understood, without either of them saying it plainly, that he was building a case for himself as steadily and patiently as she built rows of corn, and that the choice in front of her was no longer only about $91. It was about whether she would let herself be helped by a man who asked nothing of her in return except the chance to keep showing up. It was the most he had ever said to her at once, and the most, Ruth realized, that anyone had offered her since Daniel's funeral. Not pity, not charity, but a plain refusal to let her stand at the edge of a cliff by herself. There was, too, a Saturday in early July that Ruth would think back on often in the years afterward, though at the time it had seemed like nothing at all. A sudden hailstorm had rolled through 2 days before market, shredding half her bean plants and knocking the corn flat in 3 long rows. She'd come to town anyway, because a half-ruined crop was still worth what it was worth, and she'd set her stall up with what little remained, expecting a thin mourning and thinner sympathy. Thomas rode up at his usual hour, took one look at the bruised, hail-pocked squash and the sparse rows of what should have been overflowing crates, and didn't say a word about it being a shame, or offer the kind of consolation that made a hard year feel smaller by being spoken of. He simply asked, "How bad's the corn?" "Flat in 3 rows. Might come back up if it doesn't rain again this week." "It won't," he said. "Wind's shifting north. You'll get a dry stretch." He picked through what she had, buying twice what he usually did, loading his saddlebags full of bruised produce that would have gone begging from anyone else in town. "Bruised squash cooks down the same as pretty squash," he said, when she raised an eyebrow at the size of the order. "No sense letting good food go to waste on account of how it looks." She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, the first time he'd heard it, and something in his face eased, like he'd been waiting to hear it without knowing he was waiting. It became, after that, a habit he never announced and she never asked him to keep. On the weeks her garden struggled, he bought more, not less, always with some plain, practical reason attached that let her keep her pride intact. On the weeks it thrived, he asked more questions, wanting to understand the how of it, the choices behind the yield, as though her knowledge of soil and rotation and rainfall were worth collecting the way other men collected land. By August, their Saturday conversations had grown longer than either of them likely intended. He told her, in the unhurried way he told most things, about the ranch his father had built from nothing and the mistakes he'd made learning to run it after his father's death. She told him about the year she and Daniel had tried to grow melons too close to the creek and lost the whole patch to flooding, and how Daniel had laughed about it for a week afterward instead of grieving the loss, which she still counted among the things she missed most about him. Neither of them spoke of anything that could be mistaken, by an outside ear, for courtship, and yet by the time the sunflowers along her fence line turned their heavy gold heads toward the road each morning, half of Willow Bend had already decided there was a courtship happening, regardless of what either of them called it. The Willow Bend County Fair fell on the last Saturday of September that year, and it was, by long tradition, the one day the whole county gathered in a single field to judge whose crops, whose preserves, and whose livestock stood above the rest. Ruth entered her tomatoes, her squash, and a shelf of canned beans and pickled cucumbers, not because she expected to win anything, but because it was the one place in Willow Bend where the work of her hands could be measured against everyone else's on equal ground, without a word said about the state of her dress. Her garden won 3 blue ribbons before noon. The judging tent had been crowded that morning, farmers and their wives pressing close along the trestle tables to see whose preserves had set clearest, whose tomatoes had grown reddest and roundest without a blemish. Ruth had stood toward the back, not expecting much, when the judge, a stern, weathered man from the Agricultural Society down in Wichita, a man with no reason to care one way or another about who the widow Calloway was, in Willow Ben's estimation, pinned a blue ribbon to her tomatoes, then her squash, then the shelf of canned beans she'd nearly not entered at all for lack of confidence. A murmur of surprise had rippled through the tent, not unkind exactly, but the particular surprise of a town realizing it had underestimated something in plain sight for years. She was still standing by the ribbons, letting herself feel, just for a moment, something close to pride, when Beatrice Ashworth found her at the vegetable tables shortly after the judging, trailed by her usual pair of friends and, this time, by her husband Walter, whose expression carried the particular discomfort of a man being used as a prop in an argument he hadn't chosen. At the vegetable tables shortly after the judging, trailed by her usual pair of friends and, this time by her husband Walter, whose expression carried the particular discomfort of a man being used as a prop in an argument he hadn't chosen. 3 ribbons, Beatrice said, her voice pitched to carry across the fairground, sweet as spoiled milk. How resourceful. I suppose it's easier to grow a fine tomato than to keep a fine home, or a fine figure, or a note paid on time. Bless her heart. Some women simply aren't suited to holding on to what isn't truly theirs to begin with. Her gloved hand swept out, whether by accident or design, no one afterward could quite agree, and Ruth's basket of prized tomatoes went tumbling into the dirt at her feet. The crowd that had gathered, 40 people, maybe more, drawn by the sound of Beatrice's raised voice, went still. Ruth knelt. She picked up each tomato, one at a time, wiped it clean against her apron, and set it back exactly where it had been, unhurried, her hands steady. Then she stood, and she looked at Beatrice Ashworth, and she spoke in a voice that did not shake. "You're right that this land isn't easily held on to, Mrs. Ashworth. I've near broken my back holding it. But I notice you've never once asked how I grew 3 ribbons worth of vegetables on a half-acre, while half the men in this county lost their crop to the same summer heat. You'd rather talk about my dress, or my figure, or the note your husband's bank called due the same week your daughter's wedding needs paying for. I think you know exactly why that note got called, and I think everyone standing here is starting to wonder the same thing." She let that settle, the crowd's silence sharpening around it. "I've been called ragged and poor and unsuited more times than I can count since my husband died, and not one of those words has ever once put food on my table or kept a roof over my head. My own 2 hands did that. So you can knock my tomatoes in the dirt all you like, Mrs. Ashworth. I'll just keep picking them back up. It's what I'm good at." A murmur moved through the crowd, not laughter, not quite, but something close to it. The particular sound of a town, realizing, all at once, which side of an argument it actually believed. Walter Ashworth's face had gone the color of old paper. "Beatrice," he said, low and urgent, "we should speak about this note privately." "There's no need," Thomas Hargrove said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, his voice carrying easily without needing to rise. "I bought that note from your bank this morning. Ashworth. Paid it in full, out of pocket, before I ever knew there'd be a scene here today. Mrs. Calloway's land is clear. You can settle the paperwork with my lawyer come Monday." He looked at Ruth, not at Beatrice. "Wasn't my place to decide that for you, but it was my place to make sure the choice was still yours to make, once the debt itself was gone." Beatrice opened her mouth, found nothing worth saying in front of 40 witnesses, and closed it again. She gathered her skirts and her friends and retreated toward the judging tents with as much dignity as she could salvage, which was not a great deal. The crowd had not fully dispersed. Fair crowds rarely do, drawn as they are to the last act of any good scene, when Thomas crossed to where Ruth still stood beside her tomatoes, her chin still lifted, her hands still steady. "I owe you an apology," he said, quiet enough now that it was meant only for her, though plenty of ears strained to catch it anyway. "I said I wouldn't buy your way out of trouble. I did it anyway. I couldn't stand there and watch that woman knock you down twice in one afternoon." "You did it anyway," Ruth repeated, and to her own surprise, there was no anger in it. "I suppose I ought to be furious with you. You're within your rights. I'm not, though." She looked down at the tomato in her hand, turning it once before setting it gently back in the basket. "I've spent 2 years proving I don't need saving. I forgot there's a difference between needing it and being glad of it, when it comes from the right person." Thomas took off his hat, which she had never once seen him do, and held it against his chest, the way a man holds something when he means the next words to matter. "I didn't come to that market every Saturday for the tomatoes, Ruth," he said. "I came because you're the most capable person I've met in this county, man or woman, and because you never once asked me to make things easier for you. You only ever asked to be given a fair chance to do it yourself. I've watched you build something out of a half-acre and a broken heart that this whole town ought to be ashamed it didn't value sooner. I'm not asking you to marry me because you need looking after. I'm asking because I can't think of a single person I'd rather build the rest of my life alongside." He paused. "Marry me, Ruth. Not because of the note or the ribbons or anything Beatrice Ashworth said today, because of who you are on every ordinary Saturday when nobody's watching." The fairground had gone quiet again, in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses it is about to witness something worth remembering. Ruth did not cry, even then. She reached out, took his hand, work-roughened, steady, offered without demand, and held it. "Yes," she said, simply, the way she said most things that mattered. "Yes, I will." Someone in the crowd, it was later said to be old Mrs. Pruitt of all people, Constance's own mother, began to clap, and the sound spread through the fairground like water finding every low place at once, until it seemed the whole county had turned out simply to watch the widow Calloway stop being spoken of in whispers. They were married in October, at the little Methodist church on 3rd Street, in a ceremony Ruth insisted stay small and plain, her good calico dress freshly mended, rather than a fine new gown, a bouquet of her own late sunflowers instead of hothouse roses. Constance Pruitt, to everyone's mild astonishment, brought a jar of her own preserves as a wedding gift, and told anyone who'd listen afterward that she'd always admired Ruth Calloway's grit, a claim no one quite believed, but no one troubled to argue with either. 5 years later, the half-acre behind the old Calloway cabin had grown into 6, folded into the edge of the Hargrove Ranch, and the Saturday market stall that had once held a widow's meager surplus now supplied vegetables to half the eating houses in Willow Bend under a hand-painted sign that read simply, "Hargrove Garden, R. Calloway Hargrove, Prop." Ruth still knelt in the dirt most mornings before the sun was fully up, though these days she had 2 children trailing after her, a boy and a girl, both already better at spotting squash bugs than most grown men in the county, and Thomas beside her as often as ranch work allowed, still a man of few words, still the kind who noticed when a fence needed mending before anyone had to ask. That same September, at the county fair, a girl of about 15 stood alone at the edge of the exhibition tents, holding a basket of vegetables nobody had bothered to look at twice. A girl named Sarah, an orphaned niece, taken in reluctantly by a family who made her work the garden and rarely let her forget the favor. Ruth had seen the way the other entrants' mothers steered their daughters clear of her, the way Sarah's shoulders curled inward like she was trying to take up less room in the world. Ruth walked over, picked up one of Sarah's tomatoes, turned it once in the light, the way Thomas had once turned a split melon in his own hands, years before. "This is fine work," Ruth said. "You grow all this yourself?" Sarah nodded, startled to be spoken to at all. "I could use a hand at the market stall on Saturdays." "If you're willing," Ruth said. "Pays fair, and I don't much care what anyone else in this county has to say about who I hire." She held out her hand, cracked and sun-browned as it had always been. "I'm Ruth. Nobody around here ribbons off a Saturday morning for you, so I figure I ought to be the one to start." Sarah shook her hand, and something in the girl's spine straightened, just slightly, the way Ruth's own once had the day a quiet rancher picked up a split melon and asked her a plain, ordinary question instead of looking away. Sarah came to the market stall that following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and by the next spring she had a corner of the Hargrove garden given over entirely to her own rows of squash and beans, tended with the same careful, hungry attention Ruth remembered from her own early mornings behind the old cabin. Thomas taught her, without ever making a lesson of it, how to read the sky for hail before it came. Ruth taught her which weeds to pull and which to leave, and how to stand up straight at a market stall even when someone's mother steered her children away from it. Beatrice Ashworth, for her part, never again spoke ill of Ruth Hargrove within earshot of the county, though whether that came from genuine reflection or simple political sense, the richest rancher's wife was not a woman to make an enemy of twice. Nobody could say for certain, and nobody much cared to ask. No one had needed to notice Ruth Calloway for her worth to have been real all along. But it turned out that once somebody finally did, the whole county found they wanted a taste of what she'd been growing the entire time.